reminder for us of all the kind of intricacies of nature, the environment, naming, and all these things. We begin this chapter with Hernandez talking about the indigenous culture expert, which we all want to be, right, Anna? Should we want to be? No, why not? It's kind of far-fetched to say that you're an expert in someone else's culture. And in fact, she says that we should probably be careful of the word expert and expertise at all. But yeah, there's all these people who want to be an indigenous cultures expert. On page 128, she says, talks about, all the people who are having terrible consequences for being indigenous advocates. This is why it is hard for me to grapple with the reality that indigenous cultures and people are deemed as areas of expertise within the environmental sciences when our indigenous leaders and advocates continue to face alarming rates of violence for their lived and embodied experiences. Is to say, hey, wait a second, why do you want to become an expert in us when we're getting killed out here? So just do your own thing. Well, not do your own thing, but do something more helpful. He then talks about the idea of indigenous rights and the ways in which people usually assume indigenous rights are just one thing. But Hernandez wants to kind of show us that things are more interconnected. Right, Cass? Yeah. Everything is connected. Very well stated. Why indigenous and land rights range from gender rights to language preservation. We'll talk about gender rights more at the end. I've kind of grouped that together. We'll first start with some of the environmental justice and environmental stuff, and then we'll go into some of the language stuff, and then we'll go into some of the gender. But as Cass says, everything is connected. We have heard in the last chapter about the holistic perspective. Cassie said some of us are encouraged to pursue holism and not made fun of if we do it. Like in anthropology, we say we should take an interconnected holistic perspective. So I get to be up here preaching holism, but some people do try to do the exact same thing and they say, no, that's just systems thinking and cite your sources. And what are you talking about? So we always have to be careful when people are having the exact same behavior. You can just check yourself on this. You just think about if somebody who looked like X or like Y was doing the exact same thing, what would I say about them? Not to wander too far into the culture wars of the moment, but if two basketball players had made the exact same gesture, and one of them is encouraged to be all emotional and taunting and all that stuff, and one of them is called names for it, you have to wonder to yourself, hey, wait a second. Or if a guy is doing something at the front of the class and you think, good, being tough. And if somebody else, if a woman is doing the same thing and you think, ooh, just check yourself there, it's a very dangerous thing. There's a very famous article I used to sign a long time ago about the idea of the doctor fit. Which is when a doctor comes into the emergency room, kind of like on ER, and they're like, scalpel, give me this, and start yelling and throwing a fit. And having all these things. And this person who did the study said that in that instance, everybody jumps to attention if it's a guy doctor. And then they're like, oh yeah, let's get that scalpel, let's get these things going. But if it's a female doctor, it's like, oh, what all these bad words, right? So same behavior, very different reaction. So we can do that with various things like gender and race and ethnicity, and just swap the people around in your head and ask, what's going to be the reaction? How do I react to these things as I'm going along? All right. So she begins, or wait, I keep saying she begins. She goes on to talk about environmental justice in the Americas. So the idea of environmental justice, and she here gives credit to Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice. Where are we at? Page 132. What's Dr. Robert Bullard going to look like? Man, all right. There we go. So she's talking here about Dr. Bullard's work, who's acknowledged, and you can go to his website. Really interesting stuff here that he did initially in North Carolina. The sort of the idea that stuff is dumped, not just the idea, the reality that pesticides and other toxins and trash in general is dumped into African-American or marginalized communities, because they are often unable to do anything about it. And this happens a lot. So again, I think it's important to realize how much Hernandez is also making choices in her own work here to credit certain people and to talk about people beyond what we might consider the indigenous movement narrowly. She brings up the notion of that, I think, linked the idea of environmental justice, that indigenous and would say Black communities have the highest ecological debt. What does that mean, Zeke? Yeah, experiencing the highest impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, but not being responsible for causing these impacts or accelerating climate change. So the idea is that, in fact, the people who are doing the causing or are benefiting from these relationships owe a debt to the communities that they are most affecting, who are not responsible for this. Interestingly, I don't know if you remember way back in the day, Aletta Biersack, who I cited, sort of, and looked up, also uses the idea of ecological debt. And she was talking about islands in the Pacific that have been most subjected to sea level rise and those kinds of things, but have had literally zero to do with being able to influence the course of climate change. And so she wanted to reframe the ecological discourse from simply just climate change to talk about the ecological debt that is owed to those experiencing this firsthand. Now, the complexities of xenophobia. Liz, what is xenophobia? How is it experienced? I don't even know if we can say what it is. How is it experienced for here? Yeah, I think technically xenophobia is hatred of foreigners, right? But then it's experienced in different ways. And we usually talk about it as something that happens, how to say, in the United States, let's say, that we're a very xenophobic society, but she's giving us some other examples of this. John, where does this happen?
It happens, and I'm starting to see it's starting to more. I think I mentioned it's not very much like a defined. It's not like a concept as a defined that you can't put in a box. It works. It can travel. It can adapt. You can adapt to even with like unfortunately you see a bunch of like slight hints of patriarchal elements. And what she is expected to be as a woman, given in her society and given in her history, is you're very pushing the fact that having her position of the indigenous science is quite challenging to them. See that, and especially when her culture is defined by her woman given birth at a young age, and she's simply not doing that. It creates a lot of tensions, and she's very uncomfortable with this, how she's seeing the xenophobic behavior, colonialism kind of imprinting itself onto and kind of painting the waters what actually makes her culture unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think as this book moves along, it sort of, to me, it dives more and more into the details of some of these relationships. It sort of starts off very hard hitting, I guess, but then it gets, I think, from my reading, it gets more and more complex as we go. And some of the things that are often expressed as sort of when we mainly hear about xenophobia, it's sort of, white US against Latin America, etc. Those kinds of, xenophobia against immigrants, let's put it that way. But here we see that, I think you put it well, that xenophobia morphs, it travels, it gets taken up in various parts of the world as hatred of outsiders, but that can manifest on various levels and in different groups. And when she returns into some of her own communities, she faces things like ageism or sexism, or the fact that she has a doctoral degree and people don't want to perhaps acknowledge that. So there's a complexity to this. And again, I think she's taking, it may be somewhat difficult she's taking some positions that are against some of the things that have been predominantly seen in some of her own communities, or taking controversial positions within the movement. One of the ways that xenophobia manifests perhaps in the United States is when we want everybody to speak English. But here it takes again on a slightly different cast. Right, Autumn? What happens here?
People are open to having speakers.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, I think that people in the United States have a strange relationship to Spanish. First of all, most of us probably have to take it in school. True. Where people don't like to have to be told to do things, so we usually don't learn much Spanish in school, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we learn some Spanish, but then it's kind of interesting that we often project Spanish onto everybody. I was my end of my high school experience, I went to Italy for 5 weeks trying to get into my heritage, and was traveling around a little bit. there's this person who had come from the United States, and she just spoke Spanish to the Italians, right? She's speaking Spanish, and they're trying to communicate. And then she's like, oh, they just speak so quickly here. And I'm like, oh, they are speaking Italian. You know, I mean, it's like, it's actually not the same. It's not just fast Spanish, you know, it's like this idea that you're going to be able to speak Spanish everywhere, you know, as long as it's kind of there. I'm going to go to Brazil and, you know, Portuguese is a different language, right? So there's this assumption that Spanish can kind of cover most everything. So that's weird. And it's also the case, you know, we go into places like New Mexico, which, why would we have a state called New Mexico? Well, we know where you're from, Liam, New England. We know why that is, because we made New England look like England. That's fine. It's new now. Yeah, we took it from Mexico, right? Exactly. The war with Mexico, we took 8 states, 8 of our current states, including Colorado, even Utah. Must be better. So anyway, we go to New Mexico and then we say, speak English to the people who are living there. And they say, wait a second, we've been speaking Spanish here. But the thing is about Spanish is the ancestors, those people went to that place and told the people who were living there to speak Spanish, right? That was a colonizing language as well. Anyway, language is a funny thing, but as Hernandez puts it, even if you're doing bilingual education, which is supposed to be a response to this, it centers to colonial languages. So English, we know, is a colonial language and colonizing lots of places. But Spanish is perhaps, before English was colonial, there was the colonizing language of Spanish. By the way, for those of you who've been with me in intro or other courses, I'll just reiterate that almost all, I might even have to say all immigrant groups follow the same pattern where by the grandchildren's generation, they are completely monolingual English and don't speak almost anything of their. So when I was going back to Italy, I'd had no back to Italy. I couldn't speak any Italian. I'm the grandson of Italian immigrants. I have nothing, right? So, you know, it's if you go back, if any of you have immigrant history where there was another language spoken, you can almost always see that the children are bilingual in English and the grandchildren are monolingual English. So the United States is called has been called a language graveyard. It's where languages go to die, and you don't even need laws like Arkansas and Bill Clinton's law that you have to instruct only in English. It just happens along the way. Anyway, I wanted to here, though, pause a little bit and talk about some of these indigenous languages. So there was lots of language loss in the United States. There was a ton of language loss among indigenous communities, and just a lot of obliterating. Fortunately, some have managed to survive. Spanish was also a colonizing language, as you heard. One of the interesting differences, though, is that the Catholic missionaries were told to missionize in indigenous languages. And so in South America and the Andes, they learned and translated texts into Quechua, in Mesoamerica, Tupi-Guarani, and Nahuatl. And so the Catholics actually, in some ways, some of these languages have actually, in their present day form, are bigger in terms of their geographical spread than they were before colonialism. So it's kind of interesting because, well, partly because of the Catholic Church and partly because of the way people move around, there are a lot of, like I said, some of these languages have grown, maybe not in number, but certainly in geographical area. So just in terms of languages and what is spoken, I think the largest indigenous language, or at least according to this website, but I think it's true, is Quechua or Quechua. There's a couple different versions of that in the Andes and in South America. And it would be interesting, I think, to write a complementary book to Hernandez from a sort of South American perspective. Hers is pretty North American, but anyway, the Mayan languages, which is what she's talking about here, that people speak in Guatemala and parts of Mexico, lots of different Mayan languages, but about 6 million speakers. Guarani is actually an official language of Paraguay. So there are people who don't even identify as indigenous in Paraguay, but speak Guarani because it's an official language, another non-Spanish. Aymara, again, an indigenous language mainly in Peru and Bolivia, and Nahuatl in Mexico. Old, I think, belonged to what we called the Aztec. So interesting language stuff going on. The Garifuna, the Griffin. Horrid. Who are they?
And trying to get the land to not be exploited and all this thing from like specific industries. I know they mentioned the palm oil industry and the forest industry and everything. And then there was this group of them, 5 of them, that all got kidnapped by the government. And then nothing ever really came of it. Like she didn't mention if they were found or exactly what they were kidnapped for. And then the following year, 2 people were murdered from this group.
Now, this group has had a lot of, that's been tough. What are they going to look like? Keep asking you these questions. This is Honduras, parts of Belize. What do they look like? Hernandez here is talking about, it mentions that they have to fight. I believe indigenous communities also have to constantly fight anti-Blackness internally and externally. The Garifuna are actually they were originally, there's various stories for how they originated, but in some ways they are a compilation of probably mostly enslaved Africans with Caribbean indigenous groups and perhaps others. And so phenotypically, very Black, you might say, but taking up a kind of indigenous identity, but have also been displaced. They're originally on the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean, and then the British sort of exported them to an island off the coast of Honduras, and then they sort of cling to an area and consider themselves in some ways as indigenous to this area, spanning from sort of a little part of Nicaragua along the coast of Honduras, through here, up through Belize, a lot of Belize. By the way, what's the official language of Belize? Spanish is one of them, but most people speak English because it was known as British Honduras. It was actually a colony of the Brits, so it's a place where you could go and practice your English down there. Belize is an interesting place in terms of its mixture of stuff going on. But I think, forget, Mickey, did you talk about how not even or having a country here, not occupying a place at all? But yeah, pretty interesting group, and you have to sort of be in opposition not only to their country, but also navigate these ideas of who is and who is not indigenous in these areas. On page 152, at the end of the chapter, Hernandez asks the questions that I read to you in the last class, which I thought were good things to reflect on for writing papers and just in general. What are you willing to do to help indigenous communities across the Americas that continue to face the eco-wars? What role do you play in violations and anti-Blackness that are present through the Americas? Anaya, why do we need to ask these questions? Yeah, this is challenging. We need folks who will be willing to give up the power and privilege they are granted within this system based solely on their race or socioeconomic status. Oh no, I don't know if I'm ready to give up. Don't know if I want to. This is challenging. I think it's good to start with stop harming. Don't hurt people. So it's kind of a levels thing. Try to start with don't hurt other people. That's a good start. And you can go up to the level of try to help. I guess I would say this is hard. If you're going to do it smartly. Don't be stupid about it. But I think she's right. I think it's true. Need somebody to do this. It's hard, but it's a challenge. Tyler. Who's that? Well, she was not indigenous, but she played one on TV. Yeah, she made this role for herself, but yeah, she was technically not indigenous, but this became her most famous role. Very famous. You can get these, you can order these on Amazon and get them delivered to you and watch. What do you think? Should we order some? No. Why not? Yeah, I mean, she acknowledges that on page 156 that there are nuances to this character because she was used to kind of poke fun at Mexican hierarchies and be this kind of in your face person. But also, yeah, the idea that they should remain uneducated, ignorant, and submissive was also a part of this role. And you'll notice here the term in Spanish, India, which is pretty much exactly equivalent to Indian, right? Columbus was talking about the Indios or the Indias when he decided that this was a good name. And it's also Spanish, which probably gives us indígena, or what is now indigenous, a preferred title. So this is something that happens in, again, both colonial languages here, and we should be careful of. She gives us another example from the EZLN on page 158 and 159, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, which arose to prominence in the early 1990s, and was sort of a wake-up call actually within Mexico to the needs that Mexico had indigenous people at all. There was a sort of denial that such an identity existed within Mexico, but it was also a kind of global movement. The person we did not see in this movement, or at least for those of us who are around, new to me, was Comandante Ramona, who was the leader and a comandante. But it is true, exactly as Hernandez describes. If you type into Google comandante, the first person you'll come up with is this other person, subcomandante, which means under person, Marcos. And this was the person who rose to global prominence and was kind of got on all those t-shirts and became the Che Guevara of his time, you might say, and was sort of lauded as the head of the movement, perhaps because he could smoke a pipe while wearing, he was a multi-layered person. But yeah, I mean, as Hernandez points out, he was basically an educated mestizo who was part of the movement, but became the face of the movement. And we kind of lost track of Comandante Ramona. Again, and this, I wanted to sort of group this together with something that was discussed in the last chapter. One of the things that Hernandez is drawing attention to is gender violence, which he says is often kind of left out of the narrative or the story of how indigenous societies enter the world. In some cases, because it brings up painful relationships within a community as well as in relationship to the outside. She brings in some more people who are often left out. Who are those people? You're not going to know their names. I don't know their names either. They're not Audubon, Cass. Are they ecofeminists? Well, I hope so. But I don't know. Maybe you have to look closely. Characteristics, yeah, Tori. Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation. I'm tempted to make it into, I don't know why I'm tempted to say Muches, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe you're right. I should look that up better. Yeah, these are people who are biologically born male but take up a female identity and roles within the Zapotec community. It's actually a pretty, it's an ancient identity, as she says, from time immemorial. And the idea of being in a third or fourth gender category is something that was actually widespread across the Americas. Before English, French, and Spanish colonialism, many of the indigenous groups in the Americas had either a third gender identity, which could be, or a fourth gender identity, females who took up male roles or had a special role in their community. In the anthropological literature, it is unfortunate because they got the term dash, which was a derogatory word from French for a male prostitute. And so that became a sort of something as how they were described. But in fact, in most cases today, some of the indigenous communities that are trying to, in some ways, validate these roles call them two-spirit peoples, those who have spirits of both sides. And but there was under colonialism, both French, Spanish, and English, and under the Catholic Church and other churches, this was something that they definitely wanted to get rid of. So one of the most oppressed identities. It's interesting. Hernandez says that they are mostly identified during their childhood. When your son is born, making arrangements, getting a role model, which we probably don't want to tell this to anybody right now because people are getting accused of talking too early to children about their sexuality and gender roles. But it turns out that this is something that has been going on for a very long time in many different communities. So this is a way of, and as she said, it's not to say that they can also often be subject to homophobia or patriarchal ideas within their own community. But in general, this is something that people have tried to embrace, think about, and it's something that has been going on for a long time, long before we changed the signs on the bathrooms. Already been doing it. Toward the end of chapter 6, she starts talking about what happens in Indigenous women-led artisan collectives. I found this one on Facebook, although they probably prefer WhatsApp because WhatsApp is much better than Facebook. But if you want to get in contact with them and get one of these embroideries, I would say do it through WhatsApp. What happens here, Tori?
Value their work and everything, money and then these big brands take them and sell them off the throne and 4 times the price of what they were able to get them for.
So sometimes they buy the things at cheap prices. What else might they do, Jacob? Yeah, you were talking about plagiarism, which we often apply to academic work, but I think here she's talking about actually plagiarizing the designs and reselling them. Like if you type in anthropology.com, you get to this other place called Anthropologie, which will sell you all sorts of great clothes, some of which have been appropriated from other societies in a not very nice way. So yes, when you're plagiarizing, just remember that this is a very bad thing to do because you're taking somebody else's work and you're reselling it. In this case, this is a couple years ago, Mexico accuses Zara and Anthropologie, not me, the company, of cultural appropriation. Although the anthropologists have been accused of this too, don't get me wrong. But in this case, they are definitely reselling it for something else. And also, anyway, I've heard of those 2 brands. What's interesting to me here, I mean, I don't know exactly how these things work, but what if Mexico wins? Who's going to get the money? Right? Yeah, right. I mean, it's like, how come the cooperative can't sue them? You know what I mean? Like, how come these people don't sue them? Now, I'm going to just hope that this is all going to work out, right? That the Ministry of Culture is going to pay back the Indigenous Mixteca community, but I have a bad feeling that even if they won, it would be Mexico that would win. And as we've heard, Mexico isn't always doing the best thing. So, yeah. Interesting. Ecofeminism. Haven't heard this term for a while since Moran. Moran said, what did he say about the ecofeminists? They probably have a point or something. They may with good reason have a point. I said that was the academic kiss of death, because it's like, you don't want to be doing that. The ecofeminists are too strong, or I mean, too radical. So you don't want to be doing that. But what's her attitude toward ecofeminism? Ooh, everybody's scared now. I'm pretty scary. I often say things wrong now, so you know, you can document it and tell me afterwards. Next.
Pretty sure it's like putting gendered things into the environment.
Oh, okay. I see. Oh, yeah, I guess we haven't really defined what ecofeminism is, have we? No, no, and I just said, what's her attitude without even giving us a definition. I've just been up here sputtering on about ecofeminism, feminism, and just sputtering about it. When we encountered ecofeminism back in Moran, he talked about a movement that said, in order to save the environment, we had to dismantle all the hierarchies of, you know, man over woman, man over nature. And Moran said, perhaps they have a point. Now, I guess the reason I'm asking what is her attitude towards ecofeminism is that you may know that in some cases, women of color have not responded well to feminism. They have said that it is too much of a Western, too much of an elitist discourse, and it doesn't apply to African-American communities or African communities or even indigenous communities. And so that's why I'm asking you what her attitude toward ecofeminism is here, because she could just say, like she said about conservation, that ecofeminism or feminism is a Western construct. We don't need it. Tyler? Yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I would say that you do not have to necessarily be a feminist to take that perspective, as sort of pro-woman perspective, but I'll give you that. We'll just say that she does embrace the idea of ecofeminism. And like I said, I think she's taking a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a surprise position, but it's not what everybody would have said. That ecofeminism is an integral component of my indigeneity. And so she's embracing both being indigenous and being an ecofeminist and participating in an anti-racist movement and embracing a fight against anti-Blackness and embracing Blackness as indigenous, fighting against these are all things that are not necessarily, she has fights within her own groups about. So they're difficult positions to take, advocating for the third gender identity and against homophobia, etc. So, I mean, it's an interesting, I guess it's an interesting position in that it has not always been the case that this would be seen as something that indigenous people should embrace and make an integral component of indigeneity.